The grief had a texture. For 14 years, Elena had learned this. It was not a sharp, piercing thing anymore, but a heavy blanket woven from memory and silence, a permanent weight upon her shoulders. Her small apartment was a museum of a life that had been abruptly paused. In the living room, a framed photograph of a 9-year-old girl with a gap-toothed smile and eyes the color of summer twilight sat on the mantelpiece. Lila. Her Lila. The rest of the world had moved on as it always did. News cycles spun, seasons changed, but for Elena, it was always the last week of July. The air thick with the smell of pine needles and lake water, the last time she had seen her daughter alive. Lila had vanished from Camp Clearwater during the last night of a 2-week sleepaway. There had been no signs of a struggle, no witnesses, no ransom note. It was as if the forest had simply opened its mouth and swallowed her whole. A massive search had yielded nothing but a single, muddy sneaker near the edge of the camp's property. The investigation, led by a weary but kind detective named Miller, had eventually run cold, leaving behind a file thick with dead ends and a mother suspended in the amber of unresolved loss. Elena's life had become a quiet routine of work at the local library, solitary meals, and nights spent staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of that final goodbye. The phone call that shattered the stillness came on a Tuesday afternoon, under a gray, weeping sky. It was her sister, Maria, her voice crackling with a strange mixture of excitement and apology. She had been browsing in a second-hand shop in a town 50 miles away, a place called Oakhaven, looking for vintage picture frames. And she had seen it, a bracelet, a child's charm bracelet, tarnished with age, lying in a dusty glass case among mismatched cufflinks and gaudy costume jewelry. But it was the charm that had caught her eye, a tiny, hand-painted ceramic bluebird. Elena's heart began a frantic, painful rhythm against her ribs. She had painted that bluebird herself. It was one of a kind, a clumsy but love-filled creation for Lila's 8th birthday. The bracelet was Lila's. Maria was sure of it. Elena felt a dizzying wave of nausea and a feeling she had not allowed herself in over a decade. A thin, terrifying sliver of hope. After 14 years of absolute nothing, a ghost from the past had just washed up on the shore of the present, and Elena knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that she had to go and claim it. A maelstrom of thoughts swirled in Elena's mind as she drove. Hope was a dangerous, double-edged thing. It could illuminate the dark, but it could also carve you up from the inside. For years, she had meticulously starved it, locked it away in the deepest cellar of her heart because its absence was more bearable than its constant, flickering torment. Now it was loose, a feral creature clawing at her composure. What if Maria was wrong? What if it was just a similar bracelet, a cruel coincidence designed by a heartless universe? The very idea was a physical pain, a pre-echo of a fresh devastation she was not sure she could survive. Yet, her hands gripped the steering wheel, her foot pressed the accelerator. Intuition, an old, dormant muscle, had been shocked awake. The bracelet was more than an object. It was a voice calling out from the abyss of the past. It was the first breadcrumb in a trail that had been cold for 14 years. She had to follow. She had to know. The questions were overwhelming. Where had it been all this time? Who had possessed it? And how, after all these years, did it end up in a forgotten corner of a dusty thrift store? Each question was a hammer blow against the fragile walls she had built around her grief. The thrift store in Oakhaven smelled of mothballs and forgotten histories. Sunlight struggled through grimy windows, illuminating dancing dust motes in the air. Elena's gaze swept over shelves of chipped mugs and racks of faded clothing, her heart pounding a frantic tempo. She found the glass counter near the back, and there it was, nestled on a bed of faded red velvet. The silver chain was tarnished almost black, but the charms were unmistakable. The tiny silver star, the little bell that no longer chimed, and there, at the center, the bluebird. Its paint was chipped, its once bright glaze now dull, but it was hers. It was Lila's. Elena's breath hitched. She reached out a trembling hand and pressed it against the cool glass, a silent communion with the last piece of her daughter she had ever touched. The store owner, A kind-faced woman with weary eyes unlocked the case. As Elena held it in her palm, the cold, familiar weight of it was an electric shock. It was real. It was here. After a brief, choked explanation, she paid the small price, her hands shaking so badly she could barely handle the cash. She asked the owner where the bracelet had come from, her voice a raw whisper. The woman just shrugged apologetically. It had come in with a large batch of house clearance donations from a local charity that collected from all over the county. There were no names, no records. It was another dead end. But it was a dead end with a relic in her hand. Driving away from the store, she pulled over to the side of a quiet road, the bracelet clutched in her fist. She called Maria, the words tumbling out in a torrent of relief and terror. "It's hers, Maria. It's really hers." Silence met her on the other end of the line, thick with concern. "Elena," her sister began, her voice gentle, cautious. "What does this mean? What are you going to do? Please, don't let this drag you back down into that place. Could have been lost and found a dozen times." It could mean nothing. Maria's words were rational, born of love and a desire to protect her from more pain. But they felt like an anchor trying to hold back a ship that had just caught a hurricane wind. Elena knew her sister was right to be worried. This path could lead to nothing but a deeper, more agonizing heartbreak. But turning back was no longer an option. The discovery of the bracelet had not just reopened a wound. It had reignited a fire. For the first time in 14 years, the mother in her had a job to do. Days turned into a week. The bracelet sat on her bedside table, a constant, silent accusation. It was a beginning, not an end. But where did the thread lead? Elena's mind, a place she had deliberately kept placid for so long, became a whirlwind of frantic activity. She retraced every step of the original investigation in her memory, poring over the phantom details. The camp. It always came back to the camp. Camp Clearwater had been shut down a year after Lila's disappearance, the cloud of tragedy too thick for it to survive. The owner had sold the land, and the staff had scattered to the winds. One name, however, remained fixed in her mind. Mr. Henderson, the camp director. He had been the face of the tragedy for the media. A portly, kind-faced man with a soothing voice and eyes that had seemed to swim with genuine sorrow. He had been so helpful, so broken up. He had personally organized search parties, comforted grieving parents, and spoken to the press with a perfect blend of authority and compassion. He was the very picture of a man dedicated to children. He had retired shortly after the camp closed, citing a broken heart. He had simply faded away. Elena found herself wondering about him, not with suspicion, but with a vague, nagging curiosity. He was the last person in a position of authority to see all those children, to know the grounds, to be responsible for their safety. Driven by a compulsion she could no longer ignore, Elena spent an afternoon online, falling down a rabbit hole of public records and old news articles. It was surprisingly easy to find him. Arthur Henderson. He was living a quiet, secluded life in a small town called Maple Creek, a good 2 hours' drive away. It was madness, she told herself. What could she possibly say to him? "Hello. After 14 years, I found my daughter's bracelet and I thought I'd come and ask you about it." It sounded unhinged. Maria's warnings echoed in her ears. But the weight of the bracelet on her nightstand was heavier than any doubt. She had to do something. She had to look him in the eye. The drive to Maple Creek was a journey into the heart of her own fear. Henderson lived in a modest, immaculately kept house on a quiet, tree-lined street. The lawn was perfectly manicured, the windows clean, the paint fresh. It was a portrait of peaceful retirement. Elena sat in her car for a long time, her courage wavering. This was a man who had shown her nothing but kindness in the worst moments of her life. Accosting him felt like a betrayal. But the image of the bracelet, tarnished and alone in that glass case, propelled her out of the car and up the stone walkway. When he answered the door, he looked older, grayer, and thinner, but his eyes were the same, soft and, at first glance, kind. He blinked, a flicker of confusion crossing his face before a slow, pained recognition dawned. "Elena," he said. His voice the same soothing baritone she remembered. My goodness! It's been a long time. He invited her in. His demeanor a seamless blend of surprise and paternal concern. He offered her tea. She refused. She sat on the edge of a stiff, floral-patterned sofa, her purse clutched in her lap. She did not know how to begin, so she simply opened her purse and took out the bracelet, laying it on the polished wood of the coffee table between them. I found this, she said, her voice steadier than she expected. In a thrift store. In Oak Haven. Henderson stared at the bracelet, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then, his face crumpled into a mask of familiar, theatrical sorrow. He picked it up, his thick fingers turning it over. Oh, my dear Elena, he sighed, shaking his head. Lila's bracelet. I remember it so well. He looked up at her, his eyes glistening with what appeared to be unshed tears. I am so sorry, he said, his voice thick with emotion. This is my fault. He explained that he had found the bracelet himself, a few months after the camp had closed for good. He had been doing one last sweep of the grounds and found it near the old maintenance shed, half buried in the mud. He said he had kept it, a painful memento of the girl he felt he had failed. He had put it away in a box of old camp memorabilia and had forgotten all about it. Recently, his wife had been decluttering his office, and she must have gathered up that box along with others to be donated. He claimed he had no idea it was gone until this very moment. He apologized profusely for the shock and pain this must have caused her, for his carelessness. It was a perfect explanation. It was plausible, heartfelt, and delivered with an actor's precision. It answered every question and wrapped the entire incident in a neat bow of unfortunate accident and lingering grief. It should have brought her relief, a sense of closure to this strange new chapter. But as Elena looked at him, at his perfectly sad face and his readily available tears, a cold knot of dread formed in her stomach. His story was too clean. His performance was too good. There was not a single flicker of hesitation, not one moment of genuine, messy confusion. It was a script, and he had delivered it flawlessly. As she left his house, the polite, empty words of condolence echoing in her ears, she was more certain than ever that Arthur Henderson was lying. The drive home was a blur of unease. Henderson's story replayed in her mind, each word, each gesture scrutinized. It was the lack of flaw that was the flaw. Grief was not clean. Shock was not tidy. His practiced sorrow felt hollow, a performance for an audience of one. Elena was no detective, but she was a mother who had lived inside a shell of authentic pain for 14 years. She knew its shape, its weight, its texture. And what she had seen in Henderson's living room was not it. It was a cheap imitation. Back in her apartment, she sat with the bracelet, turning it over and over under the lamplight. She ran her thumb across the chipped bluebird, the familiar shape a small comfort. It was then that her finger snagged on something inside the clasp. It was a tiny, almost imperceptible bump. Frowning, she used a sewing needle from her kit to pry at the mechanism. With a small click, a minuscule object fell out onto the table. It was not a part of the bracelet. It was a charm, but not one of Lila's. It was a tiny, intricately detailed silver key, no bigger than her pinky nail. Her blood ran cold. This was wrong. This was an intruder, a foreign object in the sacred landscape of her daughter's memory. Where had it come from? Whose was it? The discovery shattered Henderson's neat story into 1,000 pieces. If he had simply found the bracelet in the mud and stored it away, how did this other charm get there? It meant the bracelet had been with someone else, someone after Lila. A new, frantic energy seized her. She returned to her laptop, her fingers flying across the keyboard. She started with a simple search. Missing girl silver key charm. The internet was a vast ocean of information. But she was casting her net with a desperate, specific bait. Page after page of results yielded nothing. She broadened her search, looking into cold cases of missing children in the state, in neighboring states, for any mention of a key charm. Hours bled into one another. Her eyes burned from the screen's glare. Then she found it. A 4-year-old article from a small-town newspaper 200 miles away. A 12-year-old girl named Sarah Jenkins had disappeared while walking home from a friend's house. The case was unsolved. And in the article, a quote from her heartbroken mother. She never went anywhere without her lucky key charm. It was a gift from her grandmother. Elena felt the floor drop out from beneath her. Sarah Jenkins had disappeared 2 years after Lila. The bracelet had been on a journey. It had passed from her daughter to at least one other victim. Henderson's story was not just a lie. It was a monstrous, calculated deception to cover something far darker than she had ever imagined. He had not just failed to protect the children at his camp. He had been hunting them. Her first instinct was to call the police, to scream her discovery into the phone. But who would believe her? She had a bracelet, a tiny charm, and a gut feeling against a respected, retired old man. It was circumstantial at best. She thought of Detective Miller. He had been kind, but he was a man of procedure and evidence. He would listen patiently and tell her there was nothing he could do. She needed more. She needed something undeniable. She pulled out her old box of Lila's things, the one she rarely had the strength to open. Inside were school drawings, report cards, and a stack of brochures and photographs from Camp Clearwater. She spread the glossy photos across her dining table, her eyes scanning the smiling, sun-kissed faces of children long since grown. In the background of a candid shot of a sack race, she saw him, Henderson, standing near the edge of the woods, his back partially to the camera. He was in conversation with another man, a man whose face was mostly in shadow but whose posture seemed familiar. She stared at it, her mind racing. She had seen that man before, more recently. She grabbed her laptop again, searching for news articles about the Sarah Jenkins case. And there he was, a local businessman who had been questioned early on in Sarah's disappearance but had a rock-solid alibi. His name was Gerald Finch, the man in the photograph with Henderson. The connection was a jolt of pure electricity. This was not one man. This was a network. A terrible, creeping dread washed over her as she realized the potential scope of the horror. Her daughter had not just been taken. She had been fed into a machine, and Henderson was the gatekeeper. She knew she could not wait any longer. Hesitantly, she dialed Detective Miller's number, the one she had kept on a piece of paper for 14 years. He was nearing retirement, his voice weary when he answered. She explained everything, her voice tight with a mixture of terror and resolve. The bracelet, the key charm, the other missing girl, the photograph. Miller listened, a long silence on the other end of the line when she finished. "Elena," he said, his voice heavy. "I hear you. I do. But a 14-year-old bracelet and a grainy photograph. It's not enough to get a warrant to search that man's house. My hands are tied." He promised to look into the connection between Henderson and Finch, but urged her to be careful, to stay away. His procedural caution was a wall she could not break through. But as she hung up, a chilling thought struck her. If Henderson was part of a network, he would not be working alone. He would have a system. He would have a place. A desperate, reckless plan began to form in her mind. She could not sit and wait for the police to connect dots that were already blazing in her own vision. She had to act. She got into her car and started driving back towards Maple Creek, not knowing what she would find, only that staying home was an impossibility. As she approached Henderson's neighborhood, she parked a street over, her heart hammering against her ribs. She watched his house, feeling like a fool, a grieving mother playing at being a detective. Hours passed. The sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Just as she was about to give up, Henderson's garage door rumbled open. He backed his car out of the driveway. But he was not alone. In the passenger seat was a young girl, a teenager, her face pale and her expression sullen and afraid in the fading light. Ice flooded Elena's veins. It was happening again. Right now. She fumbled for her phone, her fingers trembling as she dialed Miller's number. "He has a girl," she gasped, her voice a ragged whisper. "He has a girl in his car right now. I'm following him." She gave him the make and model of the car and the direction they were headed. Away from town, towards the old state forest. "Stay back, Elena. Do not engage. Just keep us updated on the location," Miller commanded, his voice suddenly sharp, stripped of all weariness and filled with a terrifying urgency. The chase was on. This was no longer about the past. It was about saving the future. The gray sedan carrying Henderson and the terrified young girl led Elena on a 20-minute drive out of town, deep into the sprawling woods that bordered the state forest. The roads grew narrower, the houses scarcer, until they were surrounded by nothing but the dense, looming silhouettes of ancient trees. Elena kept her distance, her headlights off, her heart a frantic drum against the silence of her car. Her phone was on the passenger seat, the line open to Detective Miller, who was coordinating a response with local authorities, his voice a low, steady presence in her ear. Henderson's car finally turned onto a muddy, unpaved track nearly invisible from the main road. Elena pulled over and killed her engine, her own car shielded by a thicket of overgrown bushes. She watched his taillights disappear into the darkness. A few moments later, she saw the faint glow of a single light bulb flicker to life deep within the woods. Miller's voice crackled on the phone. "Units are 5 minutes out. Do not, under any circumstances, leave your vehicle." But the image of that girl's pale face was burned into her mind. She was not a memory. She was real, and she was in danger right now. Waiting was an agony Elena could not endure. Slipping out of her car, she moved into the trees, the forest floor cool and damp beneath her feet. She followed the faint light, her movements slow and deliberate. She soon saw it, a small, dilapidated cabin, weathered and gray, with a single grime-covered window glowing with a weak yellow light. It looked abandoned, forgotten by time. As she crept closer, she heard the sound of a car door slam, then Henderson's low, soothing voice, the same voice he had used on her. It was a sound that now made her skin crawl. Suddenly, the night was split by the piercing shriek of police sirens converging on their location. Blue and red lights flashed through the trees, turning the woods into a chaotic, strobing nightmare. Officers swarmed the property, their shouts of "Police! Show me your hands!" echoing through the clearing. Elena flattened herself behind a large oak tree as they breached the cabin door. She heard a scuffle, a man's angry shout, and then the sharp click of handcuffs. They brought Henderson out, his face no longer a mask of gentle kindness, but a contorted visage of pure, unadulterated rage. They also brought out the girl, wrapping her in a blanket. She was weeping, but she was safe. Detective Miller found Elena by the tree, his face grim in the flashing lights. "You shouldn't have gotten out of the car," he said. But there was no heat in his words, only exhaustion and a dawning respect. "Let's see what this monster was hiding." The cabin itself was sparse. A cot, a table, a chair. It seemed almost too simple. But Elena's intuition, now a finely honed instrument, screamed that there was more. Her eyes scanned the floor and fixed on a large, out-of-place bearskin rug. It was too new, too clean for the rest of the squalid shack. "There," she whispered, pointing. Underneath, an officer pulled the rug aside, revealing the clean, sharp lines of a trapdoor cut into the floorboards, complete with a recessed metal handle. 2 officers heaved it open, revealing a steep set of wooden stairs leading down into absolute darkness. A powerful flashlight cut through the gloom, and what it revealed stole the breath from every person standing at the edge of the pit. It was not just a cellar. It was a meticulously constructed prison. The space was larger than the cabin above it, a hidden basement reinforced with concrete and soundproofed. There was a small, grim room with a mattress on the floor and heavy bolts on the outside of the door. But it was the other side of the basement that revealed the true, sickening scope of the operation. It was an office. A filing cabinet stood against one wall, and a large corkboard was covered in photographs. Dozens of them, all of young girls and boys. Some were smiling school pictures. Others were candid, long-lens shots of children in parks or walking down the street. It was a catalog of potential victims. On a metal desk, they found ledgers filled with dates, names, and sums of money. And in a locked box, they found the trophies. A small, horrifying collection of personal items. A child's barrette, a single earring, a Boy Scout neckerchief, and several more charm bracelets, each with a unique, telltale charm. Lila's bracelet had not been a one-off trophy. It had been part of a rotating collection, a memento passed between members of this hideous club. Henderson was not a lone predator. He was a supplier, a talent scout who used his position of trust at the camp and in his community to identify and procure vulnerable children for a network of wealthy, powerful abusers. The man from the photograph, Gerald Finch, was just one of them. Lila had been his first failure and his first success. She had run and he had caught her, and in doing so he had discovered a new, monstrous vocation. The full, depraved nature of the crime settled upon them all, a suffocating, poisonous cloud. This was not about one missing girl. It was about a hidden, systemic evil that had operated for years, right under their noses, orchestrated by a man who looked like everyone's favorite grandfather. As the forensic teams began their grim work, documenting the decades of pain stored in that lightless hole, Elena finally allowed herself to collapse. The weight of 14 years of uncertainty replaced by the crushing weight of a truth more terrible than her darkest nightmares. The police station was a sterile, fluorescent-lit purgatory. Elena sat in a small, windowless room, a cup of untouched coffee growing cold in her hands. The adrenaline had long since evaporated, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. Detective Miller sat with her, not as a cop with a witness, but as a man bearing witness to the end of a long, dark road. He looked 10 years older than he had that afternoon. He told her that Henderson, confronted with the evidence from the cabin, had remained chillingly silent, his mask of civility replaced by a cold, reptilian stillness. His accomplice, the girl's own stepfather who had been paid to facilitate her abduction, had confessed everything. The rescued girl, whose name was Chloe, was in another room with her mother and a trauma counselor. Her testimony was the key that unlocked the final, horrifying doors. She spoke of Henderson's careful grooming, the way he had presented himself as a friend, a mentor, a safe harbor from her troubled home life. She explained the network, confirming their worst fears. She had heard them speak of others, of girls from years ago. She had heard them mention a girl who fought back, a girl from a camp, a girl named Lila. Miller relayed the information to Elena with a gentle, pained reluctance. According to the accomplice's confession, Lila had not been the intended target that night at Camp Clearwater. She had stumbled upon Henderson attempting to lure another child away from the bonfire. She had recognized the danger and tried to run, to get help. Henderson had panicked and grabbed her. He had taken her not to the hidden cabin, which had not yet been built, but to a remote location miles away. She was his first, an accident that had become an opportunity. The bracelet was the first trophy he ever took. The full truth of what happened to her in the weeks that followed was a story of unimaginable horror, ending with her being sold to another man in the network. She had not survived for long. The words fell on Elena like physical blows. The truth she had sought for 14 years had finally arrived, and it was a monster. There was no miraculous reunion, no tearful embrace, only the brutal, jagged confirmation of her daughter's fate. The long, ambiguous nightmare of not knowing was over, replaced by the sharp, specific agony of knowing. In a strange, sad way, it was a form of closure. Her search was done. Lila was no longer lost in the woods or a nameless runaway in a faraway city. She was a victim of a crime so vast and evil it was almost incomprehensible. And now, the men responsible would face justice. Miller looked at her, his eyes filled with a deep, sorrowful respect. "You did this, Elena," he said quietly. "You found her. You saved that girl tonight. You brought them all down. Your persistence, your refusal to let it go. It made all the difference." His words were a small, solid anchor in the swirling sea of her grief. She had not been a hysterical mother chasing ghosts. Her intuition had been a compass pointing true north all along. She had listened to her daughter's silent call across the years, and she had answered. The weeks that followed were a blur of headlines and legal proceedings. The unmasking of Henderson and his network sent shockwaves through the state. Powerful men were arrested, their respectable facades torn away to reveal the rot beneath. Justice, slow and grinding, was in motion. For Elena, the noise of the world faded into the background. A grim sense of peace settled over her. The frantic, desperate search was over. She could finally grieve for what was, not what might be. She arranged for a small memorial service for Lila, a proper goodbye that had been denied to them for 14 years. The resolution was not a simple, happy ending. It was the beginning of a different kind of life, one built on the foundations of a terrible truth. The narrative of her life had been irrevocably altered. The trauma of Lila's loss was not erased. It was now understood, its shape and weight finally known. The world, she knew, would never look the same. Evil did not always wear a monstrous face. Sometimes it wore the face of a kind old man with a gentle voice and a well-tended garden. This knowledge was a heavy burden, but it was also a source of strength. Months later, on a crisp autumn afternoon, Elena found herself driving to a quiet, specialized treatment facility. She was there to visit Chloe, the girl rescued from the cabin. She had been corresponding with her, sending letters and small gifts, a lifeline from one survivor to another. Chloe was slowly, painstakingly beginning the long and difficult journey toward healing. The trauma would be a part of her forever, a scar on her soul, but she was resilient. She was fighting. Elena found her sitting on a bench in a sun-dappled garden. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the leaves fall. Elena reached into her bag and pulled out a small, simple box. Inside was a new bracelet, a delicate silver chain with a single charm, a small, intricately carved silver feather, a symbol of lightness and flight. She did not say anything, just handed it to the girl. Chloe took it, her fingers tracing the shape of the feather. A small, fragile smile touched her lips. It was not a replacement for what was lost, but a promise of what could still be. It was a testament to the fact that even after the deepest darkness, there was the possibility of a new dawn. Elena's love for her daughter had not died with her. It had transformed, expanding into a fierce, protective compassion for those who had survived the same fire. Her long winter of grief was not over, but for the first time in 14 years, she could feel the faint, distant warmth of spring.